53 years, the name Assad was more than a surname. It was the definitive map of Syrian existence. To be born in Syria was to be born into a world where the portrait of the leader was as omnipresent as the sun and often more feared. From the limestone cliffs of the Alawite coast to the sun-scorched plains of Deir-ez-Zor, the dynasty had woven itself into the very molecules of the soil. By the year 2024, the House of Assad appeared to the world not as a regime in crisis, but as a miraculous survivor, political titan that had stared into the abyss of a decade-long civil war and forced the abyss to blink first. The Muhajirin Palace, perched like a white eagle atop Mount Kazan, overlooked Damascus with a gaze of cold, calculated permanence. From those heights, the city looked serene. The markets of Souk al-Hamidiyya were bustling. The lights of the Four Seasons Hotel shimmered. The traffic snaked through the Mesa district with a rhythmic normalcy. To any foreign diplomat or visiting journalist, the narrative was clear. Bashar al-Assad had won. He had survived the Arab Spring, outlasted the regional interventions, and seen his enemies fracture into 1,000 pieces. But this was the illusion of stability, a grand, cinematic projection designed to hide the fact that the screen behind the image was already on fire. Inside the inner sanctum of the regime, the atmosphere was not one of triumph, but of a suffocating, paranoid silence. The Syria Secret began here, in the minds of the men and women who had spent decades enforcing the status quo. Bashar al-Assad, the London-trained ophthalmologist who had inherited a kingdom he never truly wanted, had become a master of the long game. He believed his own propaganda, that he was the only thing standing between Syria and total chaos. However, the stability he projected was a hollow shell. The Syrian state had ceased to function as a government and had transitioned into a survivalist cult. The elite, the generals of the Republican Guard, the heads of the 4 major intelligence branches, and the crony capitalists who had grown rich off the war were living in a collective fever dream. They held lavish parties in Damascus villas where the champagne flowed as if the country wasn't starving. They spoke of reconstruction and foreign investment, but their eyes were always on the door. The illusion was maintained by a sophisticated machinery of fear. The Mukhabarat, the secret police, had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the whisper. In Syria, you didn't need a wall to keep people in. You needed the knowledge that even your own brother might be an informant. This fear created a surface-level calm that the regime marketed to the world as stability. But fear is a brittle foundation. It does not inspire loyalty. It only buys time. And by 2024, the regime was running out of currency. To understand why the collapse was so sudden, one must look beneath the political surface at the economic wasteland the regime had created. The Syria of the 1990s was gone. The industrial hubs of Aleppo were skeletal remains of their former glory. The wheat fields of the north were out of reach. The oil was under foreign control. The regime's secret to surviving the final years wasn't a sudden influx of gold. It was the transformation of the state into a narco-enterprise. Syria had become the world's leading producer of Captagon, a synthetic stimulant that flooded the Gulf states and Europe. This wasn't just a side hustle for the military. It was the lifeblood of the stability illusion. The billions generated by this illicit trade didn't go to the Syrian people. They went to paying the salaries of the Alawite militias and the Russian mercenaries who kept the palace gates closed. The illusion of stability was funded by a drug that symbolized the regime itself, a chemical high that provided a burst of energy while slowly destroying the body from within. As long as the pills flowed, the generals stayed loyal. But the moment the international community began to tighten the noose on these financial lifelines, the monolith began to tremble. Perhaps the most dangerous crack in the illusion was the state of the Alawite community, the religious minority that formed the backbone of the regime's security apparatus. For decades, the Assads had sold a simple bargain to their people. It's us or the massacre. They convinced the Alawites that if the dynasty fell, the community would be wiped out. But by 2024, the cost of that protection had become unbearable. There was hardly a home in the coastal mountains of Latakia and Tartus that didn't have a martyr-esque photograph on the wall. An entire generation of Alawite men had been fed into the meat grinder of the civil war. They were the ones who manned the checkpoints, who flew the aging MiGs, and who died in the desert. The stability the world saw was built on the backs of a people who were now physically and emotionally bankrupt. They were tired of fighting for a family that lived in luxury while they could unafford bread or fuel. The secret murmurs in the Alawite heartland were the loudest warnings of the coming storm. When the protectors no longer feel protected by the person they are guarding, the end is not a matter of if, but when. The final layer of the illusion was the belief that Syria was a sovereign actor. The regime's media outlets constantly spoke of the sovereign Syrian state, but the reality was that Damascus had become a vassal of two competing masters, Moscow and Tehran. Vladimir Putin and the Iranian Ayatollahs were the twin pillars holding up the roof of the Muhajirin Palace. As long as Russia provided the air power and Iran provided the boots on the ground and the credit lines, the illusion could hold. But this was a transactional stability. To Russia, Syria was a naval base and a geopolitical bargaining chip. To Iran, it was a corridor to Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Syria Secret was the realization that neither Moscow nor Tehran was truly committed to the person of Bashar al-Assad. They were committed to their own interests. The moment those interests shifted, the moment the war in Ukraine drained Russian resources, or internal unrest weakened the Iranian grip, the pillars would be kicked away. In Damascus, the elite watched the news from Kyiv and Tehran with more anxiety than they watched their own borders. They knew that their stability was a rented commodity, and the rent was becoming too high for their patrons to pay. As we close this first chapter of the fall, we must visualize the city of Damascus in the final months of the dynasty. It was a city of ghosts and echoes. On the surface, the illusion of stability was perfect. The checkpoints were manned, the portraits were clean, and the president gave speeches about a new Syria. But if you look closely at the eyes of the soldiers at those checkpoints, you saw a hollow vacancy. If you listened to the conversations in the back of taxis, you heard the sound of people waiting for a climax they knew was inevitable. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and cordite, a beautiful city holding its breath, waiting for the first crack in the glass. The world thought the fall of the Assad dynasty would be a long, drawn-out siege. They thought it would take years of warfare to dismantle 50 years of history. They were wrong. Because when a house is held together only by the illusion of stability, you don't need a battering ram to bring it down. You only need the wind to change direction. In the next segment, we will peel back the curtain further, moving from the palace to the global chessboard, to see how the secret deals in foreign capitals finally pulled the rug out from under the fortress of Sandstone. The truth behind the fall was not a military defeat, it was a global eviction notice. The fall of the House of Assad was not a localized collapse. It was the final move in a decades-long game of geopolitical chess played by grandmasters who lived thousands of miles from the streets of Damascus. To understand the Syria Secret, one must look away from the front lines and into the climate-controlled situation rooms of Moscow, Tehran, Washington, and Riyadh. In these rooms, Syria was never a sovereign nation of 20 million people. It was a strategic hub, a piece of high-value real estate on the map of human influence. The illusion of stability discussed in segment 1 was held in place by a delicate, invisible tripod of foreign interests. For years, the tripod stood firm, but by the final act, the legs were being sawed off by the very hands that had built them. For Vladimir Putin, Syria was the cornerstone of Russia's return to the world stage. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Moscow had been searching for a way to reassert its status as a global superpower. Bashar al-Assad provided the key. Through the naval base at Tartus and the Khmeimim Air Base, Russia secured its only warm-water military presence in the Mediterranean. But the Syria secret from the Russian perspective was that their commitment was never to the man, but to the dock. In the hushed hallways of the Kremlin, Assad was often viewed with a mixture of necessity and annoyance. He was a difficult client, stubborn, prone to ignoring advice, and constantly demanding more resources. The turning point came when Russia found itself bogged down in the quagmire of Ukraine. The resources that once fueled the Syrian air campaign, the Sukhoi jets, the precision munitions, and the Wagner Group mercenaries were suddenly needed on the frozen plains of the Donbass. The Russian generals began to look at Syria not as an asset, but as a drain. The secret deal was whispered: Russia would not oppose a change in Damascus, provided their naval and air assets were guaranteed by whoever came next. The protector of the Levant was ready to trade his protégé for a bit of breathing room in Eastern Europe. If Russia was the air that allowed the regime to breathe, Iran was the blood that flowed through its veins. For the Islamic Republic, Syria was the golden link in the Shia Crescent land bridge extending from Tehran through Baghdad and Damascus to the shores of Lebanon, where Hezbollah stood ready. However, the Iranian involvement carried a hidden rot. Tehran had spent billions of dollars propping up the Syrian economy and military, but this created a shadow state within Syria. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) didn't just fight for Assad, they owned him. They established their own intelligence networks, their own industrial monopolies, and their own militias that answered to Tehran, not Damascus. The secret tension between the Syrian officer corps and their Iranian advisors was a ticking time bomb. The Syrian generals, proud of their secular Arab nationalist heritage, grew to resent the bearded commanders from the IRGC who treated them like colonial subjects. By the time the collapse began, the Syrian army was a fractured entity half loyal to the palace, half beholden to a foreign religious ideology. When Israel began its relentless campaign of war between wars, decapitating IRGC leadership in Damascus with surgical precision, the Iranian pillar began to crumble. The land bridge was being bombed into a dead end. In the West, the policy was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. While Washington and its European allies publicly called for Assad's departure for over a decade, the Syria Secret of the West was their terrifying fear of what would come after. They were haunted by the ghosts of Iraq and Libya. They wanted Assad gone, but they were terrified of a vacuum that would be filled by extremist black flags. This led to a policy of managed exhaustion. The West provided just enough support to the opposition to prevent the regime from winning, but never enough to allow the opposition to deliver a knockout blow. Syria became a laboratory of attrition. However, by the final years, a new player changed the calculus: the regional normalization. Arab neighbors, once the primary funders of the revolution, began to realize that a broken Syria was a breeding ground for refugees and drugs that threatened their own borders. The secret meetings in Abu Dhabi and Amman weren't about bringing Assad back into the fold. They were about managing his exit. The West gave a silent green light. If you can find a way to end this without a global catastrophe, we will not stand in your way. The most profound secret of the global players was the failure of their own intelligence. Despite having the most sophisticated satellite surveillance and human assets, the great powers were blinded by their own biases. They looked at Syria through the lens of state stability. They tracked tank movements and flight paths, but they failed to track the psychological collapse of the average Syrian soldier. They didn't see the secret non-aggression pacts being made at the local level. In the months leading up to the fall, Syrian army colonels were secretly meeting with rebel commanders in dark olive groves. They weren't discussing ideology. They were discussing survival. If we don't fire on you, will you let us go home to our families? The global players were playing a game of risk, but the pieces on the board had started to move on their own. The intelligence agencies in Langley, Moscow, and Tel Aviv were still debating whether the regime could survive another 5 years, while the soldiers on the ground were already packing their bags. The end of the global chessboard segment occurred when the three legs of the tripod Russia, Iran, and the West all shifted their weight at the same time. It was a perfect storm of geopolitical fatigue. Russia was distracted. Iran was overstretched and under fire. The West was indifferent. The secret was that the House of Assad was only standing because everyone was leaning against it from different sides. The moment they all stepped back to catch their breath, the house didn't just tilt, it vanished. The global players had spent billions to influence the outcome of the Syrian war, but the ultimate outcome was a silence they hadn't planned for. They had prepared for a negotiated transition, a transitional council, or a military coup. They were not prepared for the ghost collapse, a scenario where the state simply ceased to exist over a weekend. As we move into the next segment, we shift our focus from the maps of the world to the maps of the human heart. The global players had made their moves, but the final checkmate would be delivered by the people the world had forgotten, the Syrian people themselves. The Syria Secret was no longer a matter of satellite coordinates or diplomatic cables. It was a matter of a million individual decisions to no longer be afraid. The global chessboard was swept clean, not by a grandmaster, but by a sudden, violent gust of wind that no one saw coming, even though they had been the ones fanning the flames for 13 years. The architects of the void now sat in their distant capitals, watching their screens in stunned silence as the 50-year dynasty they had propped up, fought over, and feared evaporated into the desert heat. The truth was out. The world hadn't ended the Assad regime. The world had simply stopped pretending it was still there. To understand the fracture, one must understand the Assad bargain, House of Assad. The father and architect of the dynasty had built a system where the Alawite minority, roughly 12% of the population, was granted total control over the security apparatus. In exchange, their fate was tied inextricably to his. The message was simple: I am your shield. Without me, the majority will devour you. For 40 years, this bargain held. But under Bashar, the shield began to feel more like a cage. By 2024, the Alawite heartland had been transformed into a region of widows and orphans. The Syria Secret was the devastating realization among Alawite families that they were being used as human sandbags to protect a family that no longer shared their hardships. While the president's cousins flaunted Lamborghinis and luxury watches on Instagram, the Alawite villages in the mountains were burying their third and fourth sons, often without enough money to provide a proper funeral. The internal fracture started as a whisper: why must we die so they can stay rich? As the formal Syrian Arab Army, SAA, crumbled under the weight of defections and casualties, the regime made a fatal mistake. It outsourced its survival to local Alawite militias, known as the Shabiha and later the National Defense Forces, NDF. This was supposed to create a grassroots defense, but instead, it created a fractured feudalism. Local Alawite big men emerged warlords who controlled checkpoints, smuggling routes, and the lucrative Captagon trade. These men owed their power to the president, but their loyalty was to their own wallets. The secret was that the Syrian state had effectively ceased to exist as a centralized command. Damascus was no longer the brain of the country. It was merely one of many competing organs. In the final years, these Alawite warlords began to realize that the Assad name was becoming a liability. They were making their own deals with regional intelligence agencies and even local rebel commanders. They were preparing for a post-Assad Syria where they could keep their fiefdoms by throwing the president to the wolves. The monolith was actually a collection of shards, held together only by the gravity of mutual corruption. The Syrian intelligence services, the Muhajirin, were legendary for their cruelty and efficiency, but by the final act, the four major branches, military intelligence, Air Force intelligence, state security, and political security were no longer hunting dissidents. They were hunting each other. A secret war was being fought in the shadows of Damascus. Air Force intelligence, backed by Iran, was often at odds with military intelligence, which maintained closer ties to the Russians. They kidnapped each other's informants, sabotaged each other's operations, and competed for the dwindling resources of the state. The Syria Secret here was the total breakdown of trust within the palace. Bashar al-Assad lived in a world where he couldn't be sure if the man serving his coffee was working for his brother Mar, the Russians, the Iranians, or a rival general. This paranoia led to a paralysis of command. In the final 72 hours of the collapse, when decisive orders were needed to move divisions to the front, the orders never came. The generals were too afraid to move, suspecting that any order might be a trap set by a rival faction within the regime. The fracture became public and irreparable with the fall of Ramai Makhlouf, the president's maternal cousin and the man who once controlled 60% of the Syrian economy. When Bashar, under pressure from Russia to pay back war debts, moved to seize Makhlouf's assets, it sent a shockwave through the Alawite elite. Makhlouf was not just a businessman. He was the godfather of the Alawite charity networks and social support systems. When he was cast out, the message to the Alawite elite was clear: no one is safe. Not even family. This was the moment the contract of silence was broken. If the wealthiest and most powerful Alawite in the country could be stripped of his power overnight, what hope did a provincial general or a local militia leader have? The Syria Secret was the stampede of capital. The elite began moving their money out of the country through Lebanese banks and Dubai shell companies. They weren't investing in Syria's future. They were funding their own escapes. The fortress of Sandstone was being hollowed out by the very people who were supposed to be its architects. Beyond the politics and the money, there was the factor of moral exhaustion. The Alawite community is a small, tight-knit society. By the final years of the dynasty, the psychological toll of the war was inescapable. Every village had a martyr square, and those squares were full. The truth behind the fall involves the secret letters and messages sent by Alawite mothers to their sons in the army. Do not die for them. Come home, let the palace defend itself. In the barracks, the soldiers stopped singing the Ba'athist anthems. They stopped believing in the conspiracy against Syria. They saw that the real conspiracy was the one that kept them in frozen trenches while the elite lived in air-conditioned villas. This moral collapse meant that when the rebels finally launched their blitzkrieg, the elite divisions of the Syrian army didn't fight to the last man. They didn't even fight to the first man. They looked at their officers, saw the fear in their eyes, and simply walked away. In the final weeks, a secret meeting supposedly took place in a bunker beneath Damascus. It wasn't a meeting to plan a counterattack. It was a meeting of the inner circle to discuss the terms of their own survival. The Syria secret of that night was the realization that the president had become a ghost king. He was giving speeches to a room full of people who were already planning his exit. His brother, Mar al-Assad, commander of the 4th Armored Division, was rumored to be the only one left who wanted to fight to the end. But even his troops, the most feared in the country, were refusing to move. The Alawite heart had stopped beating for the dynasty. The fracture was complete. The illusion of stability had been maintained by the belief that the Alawites would die for the Assads. Once that belief evaporated, the regime was nothing more than a few men in a big house with no one to answer the door. As we move into segment 4, we see the results of this internal rot. The fracture in the heart led to the paralysis of the limbs. When the rebels took the first major city in their final offensive, the regime didn't just lose a battle. It lost the will to exist. The Syria secret was that the fall wasn't an explosion. It was a sigh of relief from a community that was tired of being the regime's armor. The Alawite heartland didn't rise up in revolution. It simply stepped aside and let the wind blow the palace over. In the next segment, we will witness the 72-hour flash fire, the moment when the secrets, the fractures, and the global games collided to bring an end to 50 years of history and 3 days of absolute chaos. The fall of a 50-year dynasty is usually expected to be a slow, agonizing grind-a-siege of years, a decade of attrition, or a long drawn-out civil war that ends in a whimper. But the Syria secret culminated in a phenomenon that defied every military textbook and intelligence projection: the 72-hour flash fire. Between a Friday morning and a Sunday evening, the 4th largest military in the Middle East simply ceased to exist. This was not a tactical retreat. It was not a negotiated surrender. It was a ghost collapse, a moment in history where the very concept of the state evaporated in the heat of a single weekend. For years, the front line in northern Syria had been a frozen wasteland, a stalemate of trenches and snipers. The world had grown accustomed to the map remaining static. But the truth behind the fall reveals that the stalemate was a lie. While the regime's map showed solid lines of control, the soldiers manning those lines had become ghosts. When the final offensive began, it wasn't a massive armored thrust. It was a lightning strike, highly mobile, technologically driven, and psychologically lethal. The rebels didn't fight through the regime's defenses. They simply drove through them. The Syria secret was that the vaunted defensive lines around Aleppo were manned by ghost battalions units that existed on paper so that officers could draw their salaries and rations, but which consisted of only a handful of hungry, demoralized conscripts in reality. When the first rebel technicals appeared on the outskirts of Aleppo, the monolith cracked. The soldiers didn't fire. They didn't retreat. They took off their uniforms, threw their rifles into the dirt, and blended into the civilian population. In less than 24 hours, the second largest city in Syria, a city the regime had spent 4 years and thousands of lives to retake in 2016, fell without a major battle. In a digital age, the Syria Secret was accelerated by the speed of a fiber optic cable. As videos of rebels walking into the Aleppo citadel flooded Telegram and WhatsApp, the psychological contagion spread south. In Hama al-Homs, the Orontes shield, the regime soldiers watched their screens and saw their commanders fleeing in private SUVs. The illusion of stability was replaced by the reality of abandonment. The collapse was a domino effect where each tile was a city. Hama fell not to a siege, but to a rumor. When the local governor fled, the police followed. When the police followed, the army abandoned the checkpoints. The 72-hour flash fire was fueled by a terrifying realization. The state was no longer a provider of security. It was a sinking ship. In Homs, the strategic crossroads of the nation, the elite units of the 4th Division, the President's brother's own troops, were ordered to hold the line at all costs. But the secret of Homs was that the men didn't even wait for the rebels to arrive. They hijacked civilian cars and headed for the coast. The road to Damascus was open. Inside the Muhajirin Palace, the final 72 hours were defined by a catastrophic silence. The Syria secret of the command center was that no one knew where the front line was. The traditional chain of command had disintegrated. Generals in Damascus were calling their counterparts in the field, only to find that the numbers had been disconnected or the phones were being answered by rebel fighters. State television, the primary tool of the illusion, continued to play nationalistic songs and old footage of Bashar al-Assad visiting factories, but even the news anchors knew the truth. Behind the scenes, the staff was packing their bags. The truth behind the fall is that the regime's propaganda machine was the last thing to die, screaming into an empty room while the city around it fell silent. The president, according to later accounts, was increasingly isolated. The secret of his final hours in the palace was his refusal to believe the speed of the collapse. He was a man who had survived a decade of war. He believed that Russia would send the jets, that Iran would send the militias, and that the storm would pass as it always had. He didn't realize that this time, his patrons were not just busy, they were done. As Sunday approached, the 72-hour flash fire reached the gates of the capital. Damascus, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, prepared for a bloodbath. The world expected a Stalingrad on the Barata River. Instead, they got a ghost flight. The Syria Secret of the final night was the exodus from Damascus International Airport. While the people of the city huddled in their homes, a steady stream of unmarked planes and private jets took off into the darkness. These were the architects of the regime, the Captagon kings and the high-ranking generals fleeing with suitcases full of cash and gold. The most closely guarded secret of the fall remains the departure of the president himself. Did he leave in the dead of night on a Russian transport? Did he take a secret tunnel to a waiting helicopter? The truth is almost irrelevant compared to the result. By Sunday morning, the chair was empty. The dynasty that had ruled with an iron fist for half a century had vanished like a mirage. When the sun rose on that final Sunday, Damascus woke up to a world it didn't recognize. There were no sirens. There was no shelling. There was only a profound, heavy silence. The Syria Secret was the discovery made by the first civilians who ventured out. The checkpoints were empty. The Mukhabarat offices, the most feared buildings in the country, were wide open, their doors swinging in the breeze. Secret documents, the records of 50 years of surveillance and torture, were blowing through the streets like autumn leaves. The rebels didn't have to take Damascus. They simply walked into it. They found a city that had been abandoned by its masters. The 72-hour flash fire had burned away the state, leaving behind a vacuum so vast it felt like a physical weight. Critics and historians will spend decades asking why the Assad regime fell in 72 hours when it had survived 13 years of war. The Syria secret is that the regime hadn't been surviving all those years. It had been rotting in place. A tree can look healthy and strong from the outside, its leaves green and its bark thick. But if the heartwood has been eaten away by termites, it only takes one strong gust of wind to snap it. The 13 years of war were the termites. The final offensive was the wind. The 72-hour flash fire was the inevitable conclusion of a system that had replaced merit with loyalty, truth with propaganda, and a national economy with a criminal enterprise. When the end came, there was no one left to fight for the idea of Syria as the Assads defined it, because that idea had died years ago in the ruins of Homs and the prisons of Saidnaya. As we conclude segment 4, the fire has finished its work. The dynasty is gone. The palace is a museum of the past. The Syria Secret has moved from the corridors of power to the hands of the people. In our final segment, The Final Flight and the Weight of History, we will look at the aftermath of the fall. We will examine the fate of the vanished king and the legacy of a dynasty that tried to outrun time, only to be consumed by the very shadows it created. The truth behind the fall is not just about how it ended, but about what remains when the illusion is finally stripped away. The final hours of a dynasty are rarely marked by grand speeches or heroic last stands. Instead, they are defined by the frantic packing of suitcases, the burning of sensitive files, and the hollow sound of footsteps in an empty palace. For the House of Assad, a family that had ruled Syria with the absolute certainty of a modern-day pharaoh, the end was a frantic, unscripted exodus into the unknown. The Syria Secret concludes not with a roar, but with the high-pitched whine of a jet engine disappearing into the Mediterranean night. This is the final chapter, the truth behind the disappearance of the Lion of Damascus and the heavy, complicated legacy left in the wake of the fall. On the final night, as rebel vanguards entered the outer suburbs of the capital, the Muhajirin Palace, once the beating heart of Arab nationalism and Ba'athist power, became a tomb of memories. The secret that the world waited for was the location of Bashar al-Assad. Rumors swirled like desert dust. He was in a bunker in Tartus. He had been assassinated by his own bodyguard. He was on a Russian warship. The truth was far more clinical. The final flight was a meticulously coordinated extraction, but not one born of strength. It was a tactical withdrawal agreed upon in the secret backchannels of Moscow and Washington. The Syria secret of the escape was the realization that the president had become a non-person. To the Russians, he was a liability that needed to be secured to prevent a messy public trial that might expose their own involvement in war crimes. To the Iranians, he was a failed investment. The extraction was silent. No motorcades, no sirens. A small convoy of unmarked, armored vehicles slipped out of the palace gates under the cover of a localized cellular blackout. At a darkened runway at Damascus International Airport, a Russian Ilyushin transport sat idling. There were no farewell ceremonies, no emotional handshakes with generals. The man who had been the center of the Syrian universe for 24 years climbed the ramp into the cargo hold, a shadow of his former self. As the wheels left the tarmac, the Assad era ended not with a surrender, but with a disappearance. As the news of the flight spread, a different kind of silence settled over the Alawite heartland, the coastal mountains of Latakia and Tartus. For 50 years, these people had been told they were the shield of the state. They had sacrificed an entire generation of young men to keep the House of Assad on the throne. Now, as the news of the flight broke, the feeling was not one of betrayal, but of profound, numbing exhaustion. The Syria secret in the mountains was the sudden realization that the shield had been discarded. The Alawites were left to face a new, uncertain Syria without the family that had defined their identity for half a century. But a strange thing happened. There was no mass uprising, and there was no mass massacre. Instead, there was a collective breath of relief. The war was over. The sons who were left would not have to die for a palace they had never visited. The historical secret here is that the Alawite community had been held hostage by the regime just as much as the rest of the country. They were the first line of defense, but also the first victims of the regime's paranoia. With the Assads gone, the mountains began to speak to the plains again. The truth was that the sectarian divide was a tool of the palace, and with the palace empty, the tool had lost its edge. In the days following the fall, the most significant events didn't happen in the streets, but in the basements. The Mukhabarat, the various intelligence agencies, had kept meticulous records. They were bureaucrats of misery, documenting every arrest, every interrogation, and every secret execution. The Syria Secret was now in the hands of the people. As citizens entered the abandoned headquarters of the military intelligence, they found the registers of the vanished, thousands of files detailing the fates of those who had disappeared into the black hole of the state. For many families, the fall of the regime finally provided the truth, even if that truth was a death certificate dated 10 years prior. This was the weight of history. The regime hadn't just ruled through violence. It had ruled through the absence of information. By controlling the fate of the missing, they controlled the emotions of the living. The opening of the archives was the ultimate exorcism of the Assad dynasty. The secrets were no longer weapons. They were evidence. While Syria began the painful process of looking at its own reflection, the global players were busy recalibrating. The Syria Secret of the international community was their sudden scramble to claim they had always supported the transition. Russia, having secured its naval base in the exit deal, began to frame the fall as a managed transition of power. Iran, licking its wounds, pulled its advisors back to Baghdad and Beirut, searching for a new way to maintain its land bridge. The West, stung by the speed of the collapse, struggled to find a way to influence a country they no longer understood. The fall of Syria sent a shockwave through other autocratic regimes in the region and beyond. It proved that stability is an optical illusion that can vanish in 72 hours if the internal rot is deep enough. The Syria Secret became a cautionary tale for every ruler who believes that secret police and foreign backers are a substitute for a social contract. What is the legacy of the House of Assad? History will remember them as a dynasty that traded a nation's future for a family's survival. They turned a center of Arab culture and learning into a fractured landscape of ruins and drug labs. They oversaw one of the greatest displacements of people since World War II, but the truth behind the fall also reveals a more complex legacy. The Assads showed the world how a modern state can be hollowed out while the shell remains intact. They proved that power is not about land or armies, but about the control of the narrative. They fell not because their enemies were too strong, but because their narrative finally ran out of believers. The Syria Secret ends with the image of a child in Damascus, walking through the gates of a former torture center that has been turned into a public park. The Sandstone fortress is gone. The portraits have been scraped from the walls. The lion is a ghost in a foreign land, like the fictional sultans in the ancient stories, who sought immortality through their palaces and secrets. The Assads discovered that time is the only truly sovereign power. You can build walls, you can hire mercenaries, and you can silence the whispers, but you cannot stop the dawn. The Syria Secret was never a secret at all. It was a truth hidden in plain sight, that a government that fears its own people is already dead. It is merely waiting for the wind to catch up with the rot. The fall of the Assad dynasty is a reminder that history is not written by the people in the palaces, but by the people who survive them. The land remains, the people remain, and for the first time in 50 years, the future is no longer a secret kept in a palace basement. Subscribe to War Atelier. History is a masterpiece. Don't miss a single stroke.